Welcome back. Barry Meyer is an author who's best known for his investigative work in Purdue Pharma. Now he's turning his attention to the role of corporate espionage in our democracy. For a brand new episode of Tucker Carlson Today, Tucker just spoke to Barry Meyer about the role of one firm, you know it, Fusion GPS, in digging up dirt on the former president. Fusion GPS was initially funded by the Washington Free Beacon. Then they found a new client. Here's part of that conversation.
Fusion's assignment was basically to go through Donald Trump's business, personal history, whatever, and dig up whatever information that would be detrimental and flattering to Donald Trump. And obviously Donald Trump's had a long checkered business career, so there's plenty of stuff in business records with his bankruptcies and various business problems there to dig up. Come the spring of 2016, it's become clear that Donald Trump is going to be the Republican Party's nominee. Whoever, there's no interest in being on his bad side. So who's ever funding Fusion at that point says, sorry, guys, we're done. They then go to lawyers for the Democratic National Committee for Hillary Clinton's campaign and basically pitch them on continuing their political opposition work against Donald Trump. But they say at that point, well, we'd like to start looking at his activities in Russia because we haven't really looked at that closely before. They get the go-ahead and the money to do that, and that's when they hire Christopher Steele, a person who's become sort of notorious in the aftermath of all of this.
Now, who is Christopher Steele?
He's a former MI6 agent who worked at a time for the British government in Russia, headed their Russian desk.
As an intelligence officer for the British government.
Yes, as an intelligence officer, as a spy in Russia. And then headed their intelligence operation or their Russian desk in London. And then, like many former spies or former FBI agents, whatever the case might be, he became a corporate investigator and started his own firm in London called Orbis Business Intelligence that kind of specialized in gathering stuff about Russia or Eastern Europe for business clients and others.
So Fusion GPS was hired by people who didn't like Trump on the Republican side, switched, and now is employed by the Hillary Clinton campaign, contracts with Christopher Steele's firm in London to learn more about Trump's involvement with Russia.
Correct.
Then what happens?
So what happens at that point is that Steele can't go to London, right? He's a former British spy. Go to Russia, excuse me. He's a former spy. So what he does is he retains an agent, a guy he calls his collector, to go to Russia and to meet with people and to talk to them about Donald Trump, to talk to them about Donald Trump's associates, and to feed back whatever information he gleans to Christopher Steele, which Christopher Steele then writes up in a series of memos, of which there were something like 17 or 18. And those memos, which were then passed back to Fusion GPS, became known as the dossier.
Got it? It's so interesting. You can watch Tucker's full interview with Barry Meyer on Tucker Carlson Today by going to foxnation.com right now, and I always suggest you do. Now this. West Virginia is now suing the Biden administration over its reversal of the Donald Trump Remain in Mexico policy. That policy forced migrants to stay in Mexico pending the outcome of their asylum hearings. Imagine that. West Virginia's Attorney General Patrick Morrisey says suspending that policy will allow drug traffickers to flood the country with fentanyl, and that's exactly what happened. Now, over the weekend, the Wire star Michael K. Williams possibly overdosed on that drug. Patrick Morrisey joins us right now. Mr. Attorney General, why target the Remain in Mexico policy to help drug abuse in West Virginia?
Well, in West Virginia, we feel the impact of the immigration debate and open borders most when fentanyl is surging across the borders and it ultimately flows into our state. That's how we see the terrible effects. Most people, when they talk about it, talk about the raw numbers of undocumented aliens that are coming in. We measure this problem through the amount of fentanyl and illicit drugs that ultimately make their way up to West Virginia. It's a very serious problem that's not being discussed enough. That's why we filed our lawsuit. We think this should be a no-brainer for President Biden to turn around, but he didn't even think about the drug trafficking issue when he issued his rule and tried to rescind the Trump Remain in Mexico policy. We're going to make sure that they do think through their responsibilities on fighting narcotics entering into our borders.
I guess they say the drug comes up from a major highway into Detroit and Columbus and comes right into West Virginia, where the drug abuse and drug deaths have doubled from 2019 to 2020, and I imagine it's going to be even higher at the end of 2021. So the Remain in Mexico policy is now back in play because now they're allowed to use it, and Biden would be foolish not to. Does that kill your case?
No, I think that you have a number of cases that are moving forward, and we're focusing on the drug trafficking aspect, whether it's reversing and going back to Remain in Mexico or other priorities at the border. We think these guys need to put a lot more time and resources into going after a lot of these people coming over with backpacks. We showed that in our complaint. We're seeing more and more people trafficking across the border, and even as the administration says, if only 1 in 5 people slide through with a backpack, that's enough to destroy many counties in West Virginia or across the country. And there's a lot of death that will result from it. So we want to keep the eye and the laser beam focused on the drug trafficking side. It's been a huge problem, first with China moving product to Mexico, now with the Mexican drug cartels.
And real quick, what's the schedule? When are we going to see this thing in court? When is it going to force or not force the administration's hand?
Well, look, we wrote a letter a couple of months ago and they didn't act on it. We filed a lawsuit in the middle of August. I think you're going to start hearing about that in the upcoming months, but we're hopeful Biden can come to his senses and reverse this.
It's just unbelievable what's happening in these border cities. We've been focused on Arizona, New Mexico now, and Texas, of course. California has always been a mess, but it's really they're going to pay the price in 2022. It's in their interest to get this under control. Attorney General Patrick Morrisey, thanks for taking action.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
All right. Meanwhile, major media organizations have just been caught spreading another completely false story on the coronavirus. Now they're trying to pretend they didn't do anything wrong. But we've got the evidence straight ahead and the tape completely wrong. Just like they did with Justice Smollett, just like they did with the Covington kids, and so on. Steve Krakauer is the founder and editor of Fourth Watch. He joins us now. You know, the story went on, Steve, to say that, well, they had to turn down gunshot victims from emergency rooms because they were so filled up with people who took ivermectin.
I mean, it was so ridiculous on the face. I think that it's a great example, though. I mean, there's a few things at play here. You mentioned some of the stories that the media has gotten completely wrong in the past, but I think there's a geographic bias thing here. If this story on a local news channel was from New York or D.C., I feel like there might be a little bit more radar up that said, this seems a little bit strange. But Oklahoma, rural Oklahoma, oh yeah, sure, people are just going to their barns and getting the horse goo and eating it, and then of course now they're the gunshot victims that are waiting for the. I mean, it's totally ridiculous, but this is what you get when you're trying to further a narrative and you don't really have this incentive to step back and say, is this really true? I mean, is this really the case? Because what's the cost to Rolling Stone? You know, they got a ton of traffic. They put a little update on the top. They don't lose any real journalistic integrity. No one really trusted them to begin with. So what do you get from it? You know, the cost benefit analysis. Yeah, we'll put it out there. Maybe it's true.
Right. And by the way, somebody who tweeted that out was Rachel Maddow. She had great concern for the country. Ivermectin was Dr. Corey went and spoke in front of Senator Ron Johnson's Senate committee, not a renegade organization in somebody's bomb shelter. They came in and spoke about it. And all social media took it down. They said it was too dangerous. Ivermectin, by the way, however it turns out, whatever you decide to do, was developed and awarded a Nobel Prize back in 2015. It combats river blindness and tropical maladies. Sometimes drugs work for different things. For some people, they chose to try it. It wasn't out there to make a mockery of.
Right, exactly. I mean, our own CDC right now is recommending that refugees to the country take it. Again, not for COVID necessarily. That's being tested right now. But the idea that it's for horses and for cows, which is the storyline that's being pushed in the media now, whether it's to combat Joe Rogan, who's talking about that as one of the treatments that he used to take, after he got COVID. This is being prescribed by doctors. This is not being, people are not taking this from their horses and eating it. But this is what you get. And I think really what it comes down to is there's this greater good aspect to this right now. The media says, okay, well, we got this story wrong, but hey, if we could have just maybe stopped some people from taking ivermectin, maybe we can get more people to take the vaccine if we put this storyline, at least there's some greater good to it. At least we're our heart's in the right place. Well, that's not really the way you go about journalism. That's not how you gain any sort of trust. And when we're talking about something as serious as COVID, as serious as this pandemic that's been going on for 18 months, you have a responsibility to get the story right and tell your audience what's actually happening in the country.
Exactly. So when you say the vulnerabilities about the vaccine to the Delta virus, that you can get it, lessen the symptoms, but you're still going to get it. Yet we have to discover this breakthrough before the scientists tell us. And then why don't we hear more about Regeneron? Why don't we ever hear about therapeutics, treatments? We just see people in hospital gowns trying to, get in ventilators or struggling with fever. Why don't we ever hear about the treatments that the VIPs get when they ask for it?
Right. I mean, you would think that a media that would be curious and also responsible might be interested in finding anything possible that can help people in this moment. Because obviously the pandemic is real. It's getting people sick, and people are getting vaccinated on high rates, and some of them are also getting very sick. So what can we do? Why are we not having a little bit more curiosity, and why is everything so one track about this? That's the problem, and that's why this Rolling Stone story is so damaging. It continues this further narrative that's only putting people in the wrong place.
Why Rachel Maddow gave out bad information. Why is her account not suspended? I have no idea. Steve, thanks so much.
Thanks, Brian.
Appreciate it, Steve Krakauer. Meanwhile, Australia is continuing to descend into tyranny in the name of COVID control. They're implementing, get this, facial recognition apps that force residents to regularly upload their location to the government. People aren't allowed to speak to their neighbors. Now, one Australian premier is talking about completely banning the unvaccinated from participating in society.
When we get to those vaccination double dose thresholds as part of the national plan, the notion of a lockdown of the whole community is far less relevant. But what will, I think, become a bigger part of our response is a lockout of many, many venues for those who are not vaccinated.
It's unbelievable. Gideon Rosner is the Director of Policy at the Institute of Public Affairs in Melbourne, Australia. He joins us now to assess. I always thought Australians would have it right. Man, when it comes to Melbourne, you couldn't be more wrong. You're the most locked down province city in the world, 207 plus days. Why?
Why indeed, Brian? It's because since the get-go, we have pursued in Australia a policy of basically zero tolerance for the coronavirus. Now, the lockdown that Melbourne is currently going through, its sixth lockdown, was triggered after just 6 cases. Not 6 deaths, not 6 cases of hospitalisation, 6 infections. In Sydney, the lockdown that's been running since June was triggered over just 28 cases. This is reaching absurdity that Lewis Carroll himself couldn't come up with. And as you said, Brian, it has triggered the descent into tyranny in Australia. It has overwhelmed all of our checks and balances. It has extinguished all or suppressed all of our individual rights and freedoms, and it has upended every norm of liberal democratic governance. And if it can happen here in Australia, of all places, it can happen anywhere. And I'm sorry to say that includes the US. So Americans need to worry about incursions to their liberty coming from coronavirus hysteria, because it can happen anywhere.
And I did see about 200,000 people protesting in France over the weekend, and multiple arrests because they're tired of the lockdown. What I find it strange is this app. Tell me how this app works. If you get contact traced, you have to show your location through this app?
So this is a proposal by the state government of South Australia for returning travellers who want to pass through the 2-week quarantine system. Basically how it would work is if you are quarantining at home and you are supposed to be at home for 2 weeks under house arrest, you'll get a prompt from this app. You'll have to take a photo of yourself in the location you're supposed to be in. And if you don't do that within 15 minutes, the police can show up at your door. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, Brian. This is from the same state government that recently rounded up people and put them into quarantine hotels, not because they were actually sick, but because they visited a venue that a sick person happened to go to, a winery in South Australia, where, by the way, they have had extremely few coronavirus cases. As I said, this is allowed governments to do things that we never thought possible in terms of breaching our fundamental rights. And people are all right with it because of the fear and paranoia that governments have encouraged and unleashed in the population.
On behalf of Americans, on behalf of America, we always thought that Australia would be almost the live or let live society, but it's not. You can only leave your house for 2 hours to shop and exercise. The curfew is from 9 to 5. It was triggered in June, and Melbourne has now been locked down, the most locked down city in the world. And guess what? There's no sign of a let-up, but the rest of the country has a bit of freedom, correct? And they don't even let you leave the country and travel to those freer places.
Correct. Well, not only do they not let you leave the country, not just if you're an Australian citizen, but if you're a permanent resident of Australia who has a citizenship to another country, you cannot go home, which in any other situation would trigger a diplomatic incident. But this today was reported that Australian troops who have been deployed to Afghanistan are having trouble getting back into Australia. They're stranded in Dubai now because the government of the state of Queensland will not give them an exemption for quarantine requirements. So Australians who have been sent in uniform to defend this country cannot return to it, Brian.
And the story is, it's mostly unelected bureaucrats, not elected politicians making these decisions, which makes it all so scary. Gideon, thanks so much.
Thanks, Brian.
I feel for the Australians, a lot of which watch this network. Gavin Newsom, by the way, now has only 7 days left to save his job as governor of California. He is very nervous. He's resorting to truly desperate measures that no one saw coming. That story's straight. It said on Monday that it just helped 4 Americans escape from Afghanistan. Now, this morning, I spoke to Corey Mills about that claim. He's a congressional candidate in Florida, Army veteran. He's got a group going, too. He told me that he worked with a group of vets and lawmakers to get those Americans out himself, and that the State Department did not help at all.
Originally, our plan was to go ahead and do an air evac. That was absolutely thwarted by the CENTCOM command and the State Department. When we tried to land our plane, we had approved PPRs to land in HKIA. We had approved flyover approvals from the FAA. Our plane had been designated as an emergency humanitarian aircraft, which meant that we didn't have to meet just the seat standards, but we could actually do a weight and balance standard, which meant that I could have put 25 Americans, Brian, onto that plane. And as we were at like 9,000 feet in descent, landing gear down with an approved PPR landing slot, they waived us all.
And I'm hearing this over and over again in different situations. Just hours ago, FoxNews.com obtained documents showing the State Department has been blocking charter flights out of Afghanistan from landing at U.S. air bases, even when the flights have U.S. citizens on board. Britt Hume is a Fox News senior political analyst. He joins us now. Britt, we're trying to put this together. We have no sources on the ground, but it's pretty impeccable. It's been cross-checked that Mills is 100% right. The State Department came to this family once they crossed the border of this country that's going to be nameless. What are your thoughts about what we're seeing?
Well, it's pretty clear, Brandon. You can trace all this back to the original decision to try to get the military out before you had the civilians out and before you even had a reasonable plan to get them out. So now we are where we are. We've got people being helped to get out by individual groups. You've got disputes about who's responsible, who helped and who didn't. You've got the situation in Mazar-e-Sharif with airplanes sitting on the ground with Americans on them. The State Department may not want to clear them out because they don't know who else is on the planes. Indeed, Brian, when you think about it, we don't know who we've gotten out so far. We've gotten tens of thousands of Afghans out, and on, at first glance, that's a good thing. But do we really know who they all are? Were they really all properly vetted there at that airport in that chaotic scene that we saw with people, standing knee deep in sewage and being rushed onto the tarmac and gotten out of there as fast as they could get them out because it was the only way to do it? I mean, this is an absolute train wreck, and all these disputes that we're seeing now about people who can't get out and so on are all a result of the original decision.
Absolutely, and no one got to the airport that wasn't in Kabul already. Stands to reason they'd be other places in the country. Chad Roberto also told me this morning on radio, he's a recon Marine working with a group called Save Our Allies. He doesn't believe there's 100 left. He believes there's well over 1,000 Americans left by the calls he's getting because the State Department won't answer. The one thing is pretty clear. I don't really believe anything the Secretary of State or President's been telling us on this because all has been proven untrue.
Well, we've certainly seen instance after instance where they said they were going to do this and they did something else. And the most conspicuous one, which I think Joe Biden will never live down, was when he promised in a televised interview that we would stay there until we got all the Americans out, and then he didn't do that. And that's manifest. Nobody in the U.S. government is now pretending they did get all the Americans out, except for Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, the Senate Democratic and Majority Leader, who was said, and I've seen it on videotape, where he said we got all the Americans out who wanted to get out. That is not true, and nobody in the administration is saying that that's true. So this is the kind of thing we're confronted with, and this is a stain, I think, that it is going to be a very long time wearing off, if indeed it ever does. I suspect that it never will.
So, Britt, I watched 35 minutes of Meet the Press. Not a word about Afghanistan. And when he did bring it up, it was about poll ratings. Face the Nation, second half hour. This is a lead story in any other era. Why is this not a lead story now? The compelling video of the cargo jet, people falling off the side, human tragedy, the explosion that killed 13 Marines as 18 others struggling for their lives. How could that still not be a lead story in American television?
I think the answer is pretty obvious, Brown. We don't have the kind of media we used to, where the news coverage was pretty neutral, opinion reserved for the editorial pages and for the columnists. Nowadays, journalists get to indulge their opinions, and many of them are editors now who want to cover the stories that make their side of things, which means the left side, look better, and they don't want to cover stories that do the opposite. And we're seeing this, in spades now on the front pages of newspapers, where this continuing crisis in and about Afghanistan is being pushed off the front pages in favor of, Joe Biden's $3.5 trillion spending plan, or whatever the next thing is that the journalists would like to see the world move on to.
I just have more faith in the American people when it comes to war and peace and the American lives. They care more than I think politicians understand. I wish for that. I wish they would rise up and make Afghanistan matter again. At least I know the people we're in touch with care. Britt Hume, thanks so much. Meanwhile, just around the bend, we got much more show, including Tucker